Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This channel is for education and we tend to look at a lot of different theories of everything from every angle, and eventually we may try to synthesize those things and figure out what they have in common. Everybody's kind of using a different language, different languages from their own disciplines, from their own perspectives and contexts, and it's kind of my underlying belief that they're all saying the same thing, but they're saying it kind of in different languages. Some are talking the language of geometry, some are talking in a spiritual Buddhist context or a Hebrew context, or they're speaking in music. And, you know, I think if we study many different kinds of theories of everything, we can kind of figure out what they have in common. Today is the 305th video that we've done on Dewey B. Larson's reciprocal system of theory. And Mr. Larson lived in the US in the 20th century. He died back in 1990 and left behind many books that he wrote on wide-ranging subjects, from chemistry to physics to astronomy, also economics, and a lot of chapters and articles on metaphysics as well, including dream interpretation and biology and psychology and religion, philosophy. And he left behind some followers who carried on his work. We're going to look at one of those today, Dr. KVK Nehru, and he's going to be talking about language and, you know, its limitations and maybe how to spread it out. I think I might be able to contribute a little bit to this understanding as well. But first, we want to get into a little bit on the reciprocal system. The basic idea, which Larson articulated in his fundamental postulates, two fundamental postulates, was that we live in a universe made entirely of motion. Not matter or energy, but motion. And for Larson, motion was the relationship between space and time. This sets up a generalized reciprocal relationship between space and time, which is why he called it the reciprocal system of theory. You can use this general reciprocal relationship to generate a lot of hidden relationships and hidden correspondences, and it enables you to penetrate deep into the unseen and the unsuspected of the universe. And basically, motion is a fraction with time or space as the numerator and space or time as the denominator. Basically, the most basic example would be speed. Speed is space over time. Speed is the most basic kind of motion. That's a scalar motion. A scalar motion is a motion that has a magnitude but it has no direction, no specific direction. Speed is a scalar motion. Now, if you give it a direction, then you call it velocity. But speed is space over time. The car is moving 15 miles per hour. 15 miles of space and 1 hour of time. But all other kinds of relationships between space and time are also forms of motion, or vice versa. And um, time and space have several different aspects that kind of create more permutations in space and time, particularly that space and time have their coordinate aspects, meaning that they come in 3 dimensions. So we have 3 dimensions of space, and we also have 3 dimensions of time. We're quite familiar with the former, but unfamiliar with the latter. The latter, 3 dimensions of time, is some kind of blasphemy to a lot of different scientists. Almost got me kicked out of a physicist's office for just mentioning it one time. And space and time also have their scalar aspects, meaning a motion with a magnitude but no direction. We are used to this concept when it applies to time. The clock is always getting later and later and later, but in no particular direction. It is the scalar motion, the progression of time. The progression of space would be that space is always getting farther and farther and farther apart. Again, in no particular direction. You can envision this using a balloon with dots on it. Blow up the balloon, all of the dots are moving away from each other. And it was also observed by the Hubble telescope way back in the 1920s, that determined that all of the distant galaxies are moving away from each other. The reason that we don't perceive that progression of space that way is that we are not on a distant galaxy, we are close. And so we are in a gravitational field, and gravity really is the opposite force to the progression. And gravity is maybe a misnomer as well. You might just use the term attraction, or if you want to use gravity, then you would call the progression anti-gravity. And but if we were out at the distant, out at the distant galaxies, then space would progress, because we wouldn't be in our own gravitational field. So that's why time doesn't progress, or time does progress, because we see time way out in the distance, but we see space close up. And so when we see space, we tend to see the coordinate 3-dimensional aspect of space, and we see time in its scalar manifestation. But if we were in a part of the galaxy where we were in a 3-dimensional, we were in the gravity in time, then we would perceive 3-dimensional time, and we would perceive clock space. The space would be progressing, everything would be moving away from each other. And we can see this also in the discrete unit postulate, which is kind of the third prong of Larson's first fundamental postulate, that is that space and time are both quantized. There's a minimum unit of space and a minimum unit of time. If you don't have a full unit, then you don't have anything. And if you have exactly 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time, you have the speed of light. And so for Larson, the speed of light is like the background, or the null point, or the state of rest of the universe, where half the universe is actually moving faster than the speed of light, and half the universe is moving slower than the speed of light, which flies in the face of the legacy scientists who say that, especially Einstein, who say that the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe, thereby cutting off half of Larson's universe. So basically, you have what Larson calls the material sector, the sector that's moving slower than the speed of light, where you have coordinate space and you have clock time. And then you have the cosmic sector, the sector that's moving faster than the speed of light, and you have coordinate time, and you have clock space. And the two sectors are entirely identical, except that the roles of space and time are interchanged. Okay, now that's just kind of the basics. He basically took that first postulate. The second postulate has to do with just math and geometry. The universe conforms to the relations of ordinary commutative mathematics. Its absolute magnitudes are absolute, or its magnitudes are absolute, and its geometry is Euclidean. There's some dispute about that second postulate, which we'll get into at some point. But he took those two postulates and he derived a theoretical universe from them. And that's kind of how he approached writing his books. Now, the article that we're looking at from Dr. Nehru today is probably only peripherally related to this reciprocal system that I just described, in that it talks more about kind of new paradigms and putting new paradigms into play, and the difficulties involved, difficulties that Larson faced for sure and still faces, or Larson's theory still faces, because of the language that's involved. A lot of times when you're coming up with a new paradigm, you have to use a new language. The work of Buckminster Fuller comes to mind. Also, Dan Winter, two geometers, and both of them had to have long glossaries in their book of like new terms that they use that other people never used before. And in most cases they're using words that we know the meaning of, but they're using them in different ways. Same too with the great saxophonist Anthony Braxton. He had to have a whole glossary of new words, and in fact he had diagrams for all these different concepts that he had. And so this article talks about some of the difficulties involved. Nehru points at two different levels of language, the lexical and the patternment. I think he's also missing a third maybe dimension, I might say, or at least a third aspect of language, which is just straight power. That's the power that you get in mantra, where you're chanting syllables. Each syllable has a specific power attached to it that it kind of goes beyond words. It's just, it's much more stark and direct. It's just straight power. Has nothing to do with meaning. And I don't believe Nehru talks about that in this article. He's talking more about the patterns of language. Okay, so anyway, the article is called Language, Experience, and Illusion. One of the many obstacles that a serious student of spirituality has to face is language. One uses it not only for communication, but to organize one's thinking, to direct reason and analyze nature. Sooner or later, he has to come to a clear and thorough understanding of how language distorts truth. As members of the human brotherhood, we are divided by thousands of languages. Not only man is alienated from man by language, but also more sinisterly, man is alienated from reality by the language he uses. There are two functional levels. Okay, he says two functional levels. I would argue that the third level mantra is also functional. But there are two functional levels in language, the lexical and the patternment. The lexical level is more directly concerned with meaning in expressing and communicating. There are plenty of traps in this. But we would like to dwell in this article on the patternment level, which conditions us more deeply through grammatical forms and other structural features. The task is exceedingly difficult, if possible at all, in its several implications, but worth trying. We would like to expose some subtle traps laid by language, but there is a vicious circle here, namely the fact that we have to use the same language as a tool of explanation to show the traps that exist in it. We never notice any conditioning factor that occurs constantly and without exception. It then forms part of the background of experience, of which we tend to remain unconscious. Kind of like a fish being in water. A fish doesn't know that it's in water. And I saw part of a talk that a woman was giving the other day, and she was saying that a fish doesn't know that it's in water, and an American doesn't know that it's in propaganda. So it's also kind of like an American in propaganda. It's what does he say? It then forms part of the background of experience of which we tend to remain unconscious. We never notice any conditioning factor that occurs constantly and without exception. Consider, for example, the force of gravity or the pressure of the atmosphere acting on our physical bodies. We are never aware of their existence unless an artificial situation is created in which they are made conspicuous by their absence, like a fish out of water, or like in a free fall or in deep diving. In a similar fashion, the language of our community is a constantly occurring factor into which we are born and in which we are continually bred. Our intellectual processes have been so developed from the very beginning in the medium of language that it requires the utmost detachment and celerity to understand its traps. Even after explaining how the conditioning takes place in a specific instance, one may continue to see, as a hypnotic subject does, the salient feature being pointed out as given in nature rather than as the result of conditioning by language. Illumination dawns only if one does not close the door of observation too soon. The January and April issues of the Theosophist in 1942 carry a momentous article entitled Language, Mind, and Reality by Benjamin Lee Whorf. Whorf was a theosophist and an authority in linguistics. He began his career by working for an insurance company. Once, while investigating the case of a fire in a fuel company stockyard, he noticed a signboard there written "empty barrels." He found that those words tended to misguide, making one believe that empty barrels are dangerous, leading someone to throw a lighted cigarette butt. The residual fuel from the unsealed empty barrels evaporated in the heat of the day had changed the atmosphere with inflammable mixture that resulted in the fire. Worf realized how much one's behavior is controlled by language, and he turned to study linguistics, and he came up with valuable discoveries. Now, I believe Worf, he studied a lot of different Native American languages, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know that Nehru's going to bring that out. But we will continue. Worf and his teacher, Edward Sapir, state, quote, human beings do not live in the objective world alone, nor alone in the world of social activity as ordinarily understood, but are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. The fact of the matter is that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. We see and hear or otherwise experience very largely as we do because the language habits of our community predispose certain choices of interpretation. This section is called the actual and the factual. We are inclined to think of a world of facts as against a world of words that describe these facts. Dr. Friedrich Weissman points out that what is called a fact depends on the linguistic medium through which we see it. What rebels in us against such a suggestion is the feeling that the fact is there objectively no matter in which way we render it. I perceive something that exists and put it into words. From this it seems to follow that fact is something that exists independent of and prior to language. When we are liable to overlook, what we are liable to overlook here is that the way we see a fact, that is, what we emphasize and what we disregard, is our work. A fact is something that emerges out from and takes shape against a background. Language supplies us with a means of comprehending and categorizing, and different languages categorize differently. Noticing a fact may be likened to seeing a face in a cloud. Certainly, that is not inventing it, but one would not have noticed it unless he had already had the experience of faces earlier. Similarly, noticing a fact may not mean inventing it, but one might not perceive it if one does not have certain forms of comprehension ready at hand, which language has supplied previously. Thus, language contributes to the formation and participation in the constitution of a fact, which, of course, does not mean that it produces the fact. Suppose we consider a description without sentences, say a map, a mime, or a musical notation. Then we are not tempted to regard the country or the story unraveled in the mime or the melody as facts. Here we begin to see that it is not true that the real world is made up of a cluster of facts, as a wall is of bricks. Reality is undivided, says Dr. Weissman, and since language contains units, namely sentences, he points out, in describing reality by using sentences, we draw, as it were, lines through it, limit a part, and call what corresponds with such a sentence a fact. In other words, language is the knife with which we cut out facts. Research on young children and the uneducated congenital deaf of all ages shows that they observe, think, and express themselves naturally in terms of events as a whole, and not in terms of words referring to one thing at a time. R.A.S. Paget remarks, in fact, we never see one thing at a time, but we have learnt to pretend that we do, and ignore the surroundings of each selected element. We can then give each element a name or symbol, and thus acquire an entirely new power, namely that of recombining old symbols in our minds so as to form new patterns. The power of imagining and inventing. This was man's greatest discovery and the basis of all verbal language. We learn it at our mother's knee, but it is not natural to man. It has to be learnt. Worf demonstrates that we use grammatical patterns like plurality, gender, tenses, voices, and the parts of speech, not only to interpret experience, but also to understand time, space, and the external universe. It would be enlightening to see how this happens by considering several of these grammatical categories. Since remaining within the tradition of our own language, or family of languages, is never going to make us realize its conditioning, linguists advocate the study of languages of altogether different grammatical structures in order to discern the nature of the conditioning of our own language. Worf uses the American Indian Hopi for comparison. This section is called Plurality and Numeration. In our so-called developed languages, we have what may be termed the real and the imaginary plurals. For example, 5 trees and 5 days. 5 trees are or could be perceived as 5 in one group perception, but we experience only one day today. Our language has but one form to express them both. Cyclicity brings the response of imaginary plurals, points out Worf, but a likeness of cyclicity to aggregates is not unmistakably given by experience prior in language. Our awareness of time does contain something subjective and immediate, the basic feeling of becoming later and later. We use cardinal numbers to represent actual aggregates. These are counted on discrete entities. Ordinal numbers differ in that they represent the process of counting itself, a sequence. The latter, therefore, could legitimately be used to refer to the imaginary plurals, like the days or the moments of time, by virtue of their sequential nature. But since our language does not distinguish between the real and the imaginary plurals, it objectifies the latter, making us imagine that they are just as much counted on something as the former. Thus, our concept of time loses contact with the reality of the subjective feeling of becoming later. Time gets treated as a countable quantity. Language assists us to imagine time as consisting of so many moments, like the units in a length. Worf points out in Hopi an altogether different linguistic situation. our length of time is not regarded as a length, but a relation between two events in lateness. The Hopi, therefore, are never alienated from the subjective experience of time. This is all very interesting here, especially this last paragraph, where Nehru is bringing up time and, the concept of becoming always later and later and later, and also using the terms the real and the imaginary, coming from complex numbers, that type of IJK geometry is used by especially Dr. Bruce Perret, but also Nehru, for understanding electricity, magnetism, and in general the cosmic sector. The three coordinate space is the XYZ coordinates, but really coordinate time is more like the IJK coordinates, which are the imaginary numbers, and that he's using ordinal numbers to refer to time, and cardinal numbers to refer to space. So that now this doesn't necessarily mean that they're not identical to each other in motion. If you go over into the cosmic sector, then you may be using cardinal numbers for time and ordinal numbers for space. But in our sector, we're using cardinal numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for space, but we're using ordinal numbers for time: first, second, third, fourth, fifth. But our linguistic habit is to regard them as more or less the same. So he will continue here, and we will pick it up tomorrow. This next section is called Nouns of Physical Quantity. And thanks for tuning in, and have a great day.